Glenny Gecko's How To. Gecko care just got easier.
Glenny Geckos. Hi, Maggie, and this is Randall.
Salutations, brethren.
Glenny Geckos.
Hello, we're Glenny Geckos. Perhaps you've heard of us. Today on Glenny Geckos, we're going to be talking about humidity.
A topic that lots of people like to discuss when it comes to taking care of geckos.
Now, you probably have heard that crested geckos and gargoyle geckos like a certain amount of humidity.
So I thought that I would do some digging and look through other people's videos on YouTube, particularly the ones that we watch the most, or mainly I watch the most. I'm obsessed.
She is.
Anyways, and kind of get like a general consensus of what other people do and what other people think and what they feel is the best for geckos. So that's what this video is going to be about today. There's a lot of confusion sometimes when it comes to humidity and what that exactly means. It's not really something you can see. If you can see it, it's probably too wet. Too wet would be like if the paper towel on the bottom was sopping wet, like you can pick it up and wring it out and water's coming out, or even if you could feel the dampness, that's too wet. Yeah. Or like if you see the sides of the enclosure and it's like there's water droplets like all over the place for long hours, that's too wet. Humidity is just moisture in the air. So they don't want wet, they want humid. They want the air to have moisture, but they don't want to be in a sopping wet environment.
Right. Well, what's the difference between a torrential deluge or an arid desert? You'd probably figure it's somewhere in the middle, and you would be correct in your assumptions. We watch a lot of Tikis geckos. We got started with Tikis geckos, mostly because he's so prevalent in social media, but he's a great source of information too, obviously.
David's pretty smart.
Definitely super smart. He's one of the gurus, if not the guru in the biz. I would highly recommend watching anything he produces. And so we go to him a lot for information. We go to him, we go to Brian at Altitude Exotics, and we go to Flawless Crested Geckos quite a bit. The way Tikis does it, particularly gargoyles, because that's his bag, right? And I don't blame him. I like him more too.
His mulch in his enclosures as substrate. He used to use paper towel, but he switched to mulch because he actually found that it held humidity a lot better. So
we do that with our lay boxes. It's a combination of coconut husk and sand, isn't it?
It's coconut husk, sand, and peat moss.
There you go. That's what he recommends. He likes to do that, and if it's a gargoyle, he has a tendency to keep like a 25 watt, a very low wattage heat lamp in the corner of the container as well. Mm-hmm. So it has somewhere cool to go, it has somewhere moist to go, and it has somewhere warm to be as well. Mm-hmm. So that's how he has the tendency to do that.
Yeah, and the ones that he used the heat bulb in, those are the Exoterra enclosures, so the glass enclosures. And he, for an adult size gargoyle, or even a crested, it's always recommended to at least offer them an 18 by 18 by 24 inch enclosure. Gargoyles can handle the heat a little bit better, so that's why he said if you wanted to provide them heat, you could use that, but make sure it's very low wattage.
Right. The idea too would be warmer air can hold more moisture. So if you have a little bit more heat, you will be able to keep more moisture in the air for a longer period of time. But yes, it has to be a glass enclosure of some sort. You're not going to be able to do that with what we got back here.
Yeah, and he recommends the ambient temp in the room for gargoyles to be around 75 to 78 degrees. So a little bit warmer, right? And then he recommends that the humidity be at least 60 and up to 80. So like never dry out lower than 60 because then that's too dry. So he likes to keep it right in those parameters for his gargoyles.
Right. We try to achieve the same thing, but we can't get that kind of heat and that kind of humidity down here, which is why we continue to mist.
Yeah. And he only mists like 1 to 2 times a week. We have to mist twice daily. And that all depends on your location as well, because where he is located, he lives in Florida, so it's warmer there, and also the ambient humidity is already pretty high. If you know Florida, it's basically swamplands, so they already have that benefit. We don't really have that benefit. We are dry most of the time.
Yeah, because it's cold. This thing runs like crazy. You know?
Yeah. So the Gargoyles are separate a little bit from the cresteds. They have roughly around the same care. Cresteds don't like heat as much as gargoyles would. But still could be roughly in that same ballpark of 75 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit in the ambient room. But the cresteds need to have a different parameters for their humidity. He said he likes to keep those from 50 to 80%, so they can dry out a little bit more than the gargoyles can. So probably has a lot to do with the different kinds of infections that they can get if the enclosure is too wet. They can contract bacterial infections or respiratory infections, which those are both pretty serious things. They are potentially fatal. So it's really important that you try to get your humidity in the parameters that are beneficial to them. But that's just what Dave and Manny from Tikis Geckos recommend. We have another couple that we looked for to try to give you guys an idea of what a few people say. So
yeah, there's a bit of a spread.
Yeah.
So
the next one I scouted was Guardians of the Geckos. I'm not sure if anyone's really familiar with them. They're pretty well known, but they're not as well known as Tikis Geckos. Tikis Geckos is kind of king on social media. But I found that the videos I watched from Guardians of the Geckos are very, very informational, and he seems to do really well with his geckos. They all seem to be very healthy and thriving. So I decided to kind of see what he had to say as far as humidity went. So,
which he states similar, 50% for most of the day, and then periods of 80%.
He said he basically does a light mist in the morning and then a heavy, heavy mist at night. The difference between Dave from Tikis Geckos and Guardians of the Geckos is that Dave uses most of the time plastic tubs. He doesn't really use the exoterras that often because these are just easier to clean. It makes things a lot easier, monetarily wise, all of it. So he does this. If you can stack more, it works better for him. Whereas Guardians of the Geckos, they like to use glass enclosures, exoterras, with bioactive enclosures, so they're all self-cleaning. They have flag plants, which both are great because both offer exactly what the gecko needs. It's just your preference, right? But that's what the Guardians of the Geckos guy does, is he uses the glass exoterras, so at night he heavily mists them. Yes. Because with the exoterras, they normally have a screen top, so you'll lose a lot of your moisture from the top. So you have to douse it at night, so you can at least kind of keep it roughly in that 80% humidity range for at least overnight until the morning when he would lightly mist it. He also uses a lay box in his enclosures, mostly for his breeding females, so they have somewhere to lay their eggs, but he also likes to use them just for his geckos in general, so then it's extra humidity just in case maybe they needed something and the environment wasn't enough, so then they can crawl and roll around their substrate and kind of absorb it through their skin. So
yeah, that's how he does it.
And then the next one, it's basically Tikis Geckos again, but it's not, because he actually did a podcast recently with Paul from Rack House and Kelly from Eclipse Exotics. Those are also some really amazing people. They know a lot of stuff. They've been doing this for many, 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 many years. So when I saw that podcast, I watched the whole thing, and they had lots of good information. And I'll be linking all of the videos in my description box, so if you wanted to watch them yourself, you could. But I highly suggest that you watch this podcast because they gave away a lot of really good information. But I really just wanted to touch base on the humidity factor for this video because they actually had some interesting points. Paul and Kelly, basically, their point of view on it was they believe that most people, when you buy a gecko, they'll tell you that you have to have a dry out period, or it has to be completely bone dry before you mist again. And here's the thing with that. Their point of view is that that all started because people had to create care sheets. So care sheets never used to be a thing. But then I think what happened is people that were new to it, they would jump into it and they would start, getting geckos, and they wouldn't know how to necessarily take care of them because they were kind of a new thing back, in the 90s, 2000s area. And So then a lot of these animals were getting sick and they were dying because, you know, they didn't know the proper care. So the breeders were like, well, I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to make this care sheet so there's less risk for fatalities. So they would always make it known, hey, you have to get it up to 80, but then let it completely dry out. So that way you're not keeping the enclosure way too wet and you're not drying it out all the time. But Paul and Kelly, their standpoint on it was that the care sheets don't mean anything. That they don't even need to exist. And they were saying that geckos absorb moisture through their skin. That's how they get a good majority of their moisture is through their skin. And that's why ambient humidity is more important than a bowl of water. So if you have a high heat, so say your ambient heat's like 80 degrees, but your humidity is super low, it's like at 40, 50, you're gonna dry your gecko out because there's not enough moisture for them to absorb to be able to cool themselves off or to be able to, you know what I mean? They'll dehydrate, basically.
You're gonna see it when they shed.
Exactly. So they're saying have a good balance. So you can have your temperatures up to 80 as long as your humidity is up to 80. If you can't get your humidity up to 80 to match the high temp, then you should keep it lower. So, but that's what they like to do. They also live in Florida, so their humidity is pretty high. So they're not really worried on a hot day. They just provide, you know, extra misting or extra bowls of water. They're not worried about it because they know that their humidity is high enough that their geckos aren't going to be affected, and they've never had any issues as far as shedding goes or anything like that. So, but if you wanted to like check out the information yourself and hear it from the horse's mouth, I will be linking that in the description box so you can check it out yourself. But that's what I got from it, and I thought that was pretty interesting because it was completely controversial to what I've been told even myself when I bought my geckos. Like, I've always been told you have to have a dry out period. It has to dry out and be completely bone dry before you rinse it again. And it was very confusing because I kept hearing lots of different conflicting information, and I noticed when I would let my geckos dry out, I would have more shedding issues. So
right? As long as they're not hurt.
So, but there are lots of different like illnesses that they can get from having either too wet or too dry, and we're going to be discussing that next.
So if they're too dry, you're going to have problems shedding, obviously. Like Maggie said, they absorb a lot of water through osmosis, which I just want to say osmosis because that's fun. But, you know, if you're starting to get stuck shed, that shed's going to build up. It's going to start clamping off areas, almost like a Band-Aid that's too tight. You know, particularly their tail and particularly their feet, you're going to find buildup of shed there, and then it's hard to remove as well. Plus they're moving around. It's not like you can put these things under, or we can anyway, maybe you can, but that's what's going to happen if it gets too dry, and they're going to end up losing appendages or getting an infection or something of that nature, and none of it's good. You don't want that. I don't want that. No one wants that. On the flip side of it, if they are too wet, they could get upper respiratory infections, runny nose, labored breathing, odd discharges, things like that.
Weight loss is a huge one for both shedding problems and respiratory infections.
Right.
Yeah.
Lethargy, they're tired, they don't want to move around, they're not skipping around freely. Although that's probably going to be a little bit harder to catch if it is too wet and gecko does have problems. It's often the case where if someone does have something like that, they miss it, or by the time they find out, it's too late.
Yep. Another thing with having it too dry is you run the risk of dehydration, which is as bad as an infection. So with dehydration, you might notice that they'll have like wrinkly skin that doesn't really have as much elasticity. So when you're pulling on it or you're rubbing them, like if it just doesn't like spring back like it's supposed to. Again, sudden weight loss, which is a huge thing, you know, then stuck skin, like he said, tail and toes is like the biggest thing. Lethargy again, poor appetite, sunken eyes. But both of the spectrums are super fatal. They have very high pain tolerances because they're wild animals. In the wild, they can't go owie, that hurts, because they'll get eaten. So they have to keep moving. So even if they're dying or they're near death, they're not going to really show that they're uncomfortable. So it's going to take you paying attention to those little signs. Like if you notice that you're feeding them, but they're not really eating as much. You don't see as much poop. That's a big thing, because then you know for a fact they're not eating. They're not really moving around too much. You pick them up, they don't really want to walk. They just kind of like chill in your hand. They're probably dehydrated. A healthy gecko is one that wants to get away from you. So it's just how it goes.
Right. For us, as soon as you open, most of them, not all of them, a lot of them, we have some mellow geckos, luckily, but usually they'll want out of the cage. As soon as you open up the enclosure, they want to flit around for a bit, you know, then they relax in your hand for a minute. But when you take them in your hand and you're cleaning the cage or you're feeding or misting or anything, take the time to inspect them. You know, if they're breeding, obviously you're going to look for wounds, but similarly, if it is too wet in there, you're going to find, like, not odd, gross, but like sore spots on the gecko, you know, where it's...
It looks almost like a blister. It looks
yeah.
like a blister, and most of the time they're found like under them, so it's where you wouldn't normally look.
Resting.
Exactly. So like when I said, make sure your substrate isn't sopping wet.
Right.
That's why, because a lot of times if they're, because they won't always be up. Sometimes they'll chill on the bottom of their enclosures. They just do their own thing, you know.
Yeah, hiding.
Right, exactly. So a lot of those sores will be like on their foot pads, near their groin area, their belly,
yeah.
you know, that kind of thing, and they just look like little blisters. And if you're not really inspecting your gecko, you're not going to notice it right away. But that is like a silent and deadly killer right there, is the bacterial infections caused by too wet of enclosures. Also just dirty enclosures. So if like you had wet and also poop all over them, or molded food or anything like that, yeah, for sure you're probably going to have an issue. Another thing that you can have happen to you is what's called tail rot. So we actually have a gecko here, his name's Vlad. He had some stuck shed, and we hadn't really noticed it right away, because sometimes it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to tell sometimes, and it was on there for a little bit too long, and he started developing signs of tail rot, and that is when the skin, or the flesh is just dying. There's no blood flow to it. It's been cut off. That supply's been cut off from that tight wound skin.
Yeah, like a rubber band around your finger, turning purple, except for longer.
Except for longer. So if it's caught early enough, which ours I think was, you can reverse the effects and it can regrow. They're really amazing. Their healing is nuts, especially gargoyles. They're amazing. So it's not like as soon as you see the tail rot, it's the death of your animal, but it should kind of open your eyes a bit more to pay more attention to, you know, how your geckos are doing in your environment and stuff like that. So it's really important that we do our best to provide what we can for our animals. So
luckily, treatment for that is pretty easy as well, as we found out. So you can do a mixture of iodine.
Which we're not vets, by the way.
We're not vets.
Disclosure.
You can't sue me.
We're not vets, okay? But we can give you some friendly advice to hold the gecko over until you can see the vet.
Right, which is actually exactly what we're doing. Right, we are going to the vet.
We
For
have
us, that's like a 200-mile drive, yeah.
But sometimes you can't get in there, or sometimes it's in the middle of the night and you just, there's no one available, and you need something that you can help right now alleviate some pain and damage. Yeah, of course. Like he was about to say, go ahead and say the rest. Sorry, I just wanted to lay that disclaimer down.
Yeah, we're not vets. Yeah, I'm more of an electrician. But it's, you make a bath, you know, you get a tote, something like this, kind of small, fill it up kind of shallow. That's exactly what this is. You put a few drops of iodine in it, and the rest is water to a kind of golden tea color.
Like a light, like weak tea.
Like a weak tea. And then, you know, soak them in it for 20 minutes at a time or something like that. Try to do it a few times a day, which we've been doing, and it looks better on his tail, because he's actually, I mean, like all geckos, we love them all, but this one's kind of one of our crown jewels.
I'm going to grab him so you can see.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you do that, you know, treat them, and then when they're out, you put some Neosporin on their tail. Just enough to cover it, don't glob it, you know what I mean? But it has been working for him, because it was, you know, not a great looking sore like any of them would be. That's him right
This is
there.
our baby. This is Vlad Tacular. So you can see the medicine on his tail, but see how it's like, I don't know if it'll focus. It's focusing on my face. But it'll focus on probably the background, but you can kind of see how it's like black here, and like it looks a little bit raw there. It just doesn't look like a healthy tail. Yeah, and that looks actually a lot better than what it did. When we first noticed, first we saw the stuck shed, we got that off, we cleared that problem, and then it just looked very raw. It didn't look great.
Yeah.
So, but now we're getting him fixed up. He does his iodine soaks and he gets his Neosporin, and you know, I clean out his enclosure even more so now because he's now got this, you know, infected tail, and I really just don't want him to get sick and die. He's looking at you, he's so cute. So I also wanted to mention too, real quick, since we're on the topic of, you know, stuck shed, one of the things that you can do that helps, because I would never recommend you try to pull stuck shed off dry. Never do that. That's really, really bad. You can actually like rip off their scales. That's no good.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. So what I would recommend is just get like a little tub like that, or like a little bit bigger, you know, so that way they can sit in there comfortably and they're not like having to lay down in the water. So they can soak in lukewarm, not hot, but not cold, lukewarm water.
I didn't mean like that.
And just soak them for about 5, sometimes 10 minutes, depending on how bad the shed is. And it might take a few soaks. It might take a few times pulling them out and gently pulling that shed off when it's wet. But you have to keep doing it until you get every bit off. And another thing that I would also recommend too, we do it now a lot more. We did it in the past and we kind of got away from it, but I'm glad we went back into it, is Pedialyte.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So I would recommend getting Pedialyte, just the flavorless, just the clear Pedialyte. And we just put like a few drops in the water, so like their little like water things in their mister bottles, and we put it in there because it helps keep them hydrated. So especially us, when we, you know, have such an issue keeping our ambient humidity high, we have to offer other ways for them to get that extra hydration.
Yeah.
So Pedialyte is a good like little hack. We have been trying real hard to create ambient humidity. We have 2 humidifiers, and then we also have been like soaking towels and leaving them to hang. We literally have hanging towels over in the corner over there.
Yep.
To create ambient humidity. We're always trying to come up with creative ways to create more humidity in our basement.
Yeah. You want to keep it about 50% humidity or a little bit higher, just in its surrounding area.
The ambient.
Ambient.
So the ambient humidity.
The ambient humidity in our laboratory is somewhere around high 40s to low 50s. And we miss twice a day inside the enclosures. We missed it twice a day, and then the humidity, we try to keep it around 50% in the air. You can probably hear the humidifier run behind this screen right now. We like to try to do a fine mist basically all the way around the enclosure. We try to keep it off the paper towel, because that's what we use for substrate, because it's cheap and we can switch it out real fast, right? Basically get everything that's plastic in there, so we have a lot of, you know, like fake foliage, foam noodle for them to walk upon. We'll glue them inside the, there's one right here. That, talk about that. See that? It's a styrofoam noodle. We try to get those areas wet, and we try to keep it off the paper towel. You're gonna get some spray anyway, but if you see any mold, like quickly, within a couple days or something like that, chances are it's too wet. If you see mold at all, chances are it's too wet. Location of where they sit in the room, we live up in northern Michigan, so our furnace runs like non-stop. And because the furnace runs non-stop, the heat's on non-stop. And because the heat's on non-stop, it dries it out, here particularly, quite quickly. So you'll notice in certain parts of the room, depending on how close they are to the air handler or vents, those containers tend to dry out quickly. Whereas if it's in the corner of a room or something like that, chances are it might not be, you know, dry. I think this is basically covers it.
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to share this with you guys because when I started doing geckos, there wasn't really information out there on how to do things the right way. There was so much conflicting information, and it can be really stressful when you're trying to do the right thing for your animal, but you don't know what to believe.
Yeah.
So I would always suggest not only watching our video and watching the ones that we link to the description box, but also just ask everyone, ask anyone, and even if like it's confusing, just ask more questions about it. And as long as your gecko is growing, it's eating, it's pooping, it's shedding right, all those things, then you're doing something right.
Right. It's making it.
But there's always room for improvement. So
Yes.
But never be afraid to ask, even us, if you had any questions on this video, if there was something we didn't cover, if there was something that you just wanted us to cover more of, just shoot us a little message anytime. It doesn't matter, and we'll answer the best that we can.
Right? Yeah. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cool, alright?
Bye. He says bye.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like for more.